How did humans survive Doggerland? The world now drowned beneath the North Sea, while the ground under their homes slowly disappeared. They survived by moving again and again, carrying tools, skills, relationships, and memories toward higher ground as the coastline pursued them. The land vanished. The people did not simply vanish with it. And one object dragged up in 1931 would force that lost human world back into view. A fishing trawler working the North Sea hauled aboard a heavy block of peat. Embedded in it was a barbed point made from antler, often described as a harpoon. It was not proof of a single drowned village, and it did not reveal the name of the person who shaped it. But peat forms on land, in wet ground. The trawler had lifted part of a former landscape from beneath the waves, and inside that landscape was a human tool. There had been hunters where charts now showed open sea. That point posed a larger question. How much country was down there? For decades, fragments arrived without a map. Bones, antler, worked stone, and peat, snagged by nets or exposed by dredging. Then researchers began repurposing seismic surveys collected for the North Sea energy industry. Soundings designed to examine layers below the seabed revealed buried channels, ridges, basins, and the outlines of old drainage systems. The water was hiding not a narrow land bridge, but a changing mosaic of river valleys, marshes, plains, lakes, and coasts between Britain and continental Europe. Archaeologist Brian E. Coles gave that broad, lost landscape an unforgettable name: Doggerland. But a map of drowned rivers creates a more urgent mystery. If people lived there, what happened when the water came? At the end of the last ice age, enormous ice sheets were melting, and global sea level was rising. Britain remained joined to Europe across wide lowlands, but the geography did not hold still. Over thousands of years, the shoreline advanced across the lower ground. A place well inland in one lifetime might lie closer to an estuary in the next. Much later, its remains could rest beneath salt water. For the people living through it, this was not a time-lapse animation. The change arrived as particular losses: a familiar path flooding more often, salt entering a freshwater marsh, a camp becoming too exposed, an island appearing where a ridge had been. The average rise may sound slow on a human clock, but averages conceal pulses, storms, erosion, and local differences. These communities did not need a modern theory of climate to recognize a trend. They knew tides, channels, seasons, animal movements, and safe crossings because their lives depended on them. And that is where the survival answer becomes more than one word. Moving was not a panicked march from a single doomed capital. Doggerland was never one country with fixed borders, and its inhabitants were not one crowd waiting on the same beach. Families could shift a camp, revisit productive places, travel by water, join other groups, or carry knowledge into territories that stayed dry. Some relocations may have covered short distances. Across generations, they added up to a profound retreat. Adaptation preserved lives, but it scattered the archaeological trail. Then, roughly 8,200 years ago, the North Sea produced a very different kind of danger. Off Norway, the enormous Storegga submarine landslide displaced water and generated a tsunami. Sediment deposits on surrounding coasts show that waves reached parts of Scotland and elsewhere around the North Atlantic and North Sea. Any people caught on low shores in the affected zone could have faced sudden, devastating flooding. Here, at last, is the disaster that can look like a clean ending. It was not. The tsunami must be separated from the long rise in sea level. By the time Storegga occurred, large parts of the former lowland had already gone under, and researchers continue to debate how much habitable terrain remained, where it remained, and how particular communities were affected. The wave may have wrecked vulnerable coastal settlements and transformed surviving pockets. It did not swallow the whole of Doggerland at its prehistoric maximum in one afternoon. Slow inundation was the long pressure. Storegga was a violent event inside that much longer transformation. That distinction changes the people at the center of the story. They were not passive figures erased on contact with water. They lived through an inherited environmental crisis, whose boundaries shifted from generation to generation. Grandparents could remember gathering places that children knew as tidal ground. Routes, food sources, and meeting places had to be reconsidered. Survival meant noticing change early enough to leave, while accepting that the successful escape might make a community almost invisible to us. Archaeologists more easily find a population that builds in stone and stays put than one that moves before catastrophe closes over its camp. Here's the second disappearance of Doggerland. First, the sea covered paths, hearths, hunting grounds, and whatever stories had been attached to them. Then preservation filtered what remained. Stone may endure, and waterlogged peat can sometimes protect bone, antler, wood, or plant material. But currents disturb deposits, coastlines erode, organic objects decay, and the seabed is difficult and expensive to investigate. A tool caught by a trawler has also been pulled away from its precise archaeological context. Each find can prove presence while withholding the scene around it. That is why the buried map matters so much. Seismic data cannot identify every campsite, or tell us what its occupants called a river. It can narrow the search by reconstructing the landscape in which choices were made. A channel suggests movement and fresh water. A wetland suggests food. A ridge suggests refuge as water rose. Combined with carefully recorded artifacts, cores, sediments, and environmental remains, those features turn an apparently empty seabed into a place where testable human questions can be asked. The original question now has a concrete, if incomplete, answer. Doggerland's inhabitants survived the drowning world by changing where and how they lived, then joining the human communities whose dry land traces continued around the shrinking North Sea. We cannot follow every family, and migration was surely not painless. Valuable places were abandoned. Networks were strained or remade. Some people may have died in storms, floods, or the tsunami. Survival does not mean nobody was lost. It means rising water destroyed the landscape without demonstrating that it exterminated the population. This is also why calling Doggerland a forgotten country can mislead. The phrase makes a strong image, but there was no single state beneath the North Sea, and no one date when it fell. Doggerland was a name created by modern researchers for a landscape that changed repeatedly. Its real drama is more intimate. People watched useful ground become dangerous, revised their mental maps, and carried a way of life beyond places they could no longer keep. Return, finally, to the trawler deck in 1931. Black peat breaks apart, and a barbed antler point emerges from land that no living witness had seen. The artifact cannot tell us whether its maker moved east, west, or died before the sea reached that spot. It tells us something both smaller and harder to dismiss. Someone knew this drowned ground well enough to hunt there and shape a precise tool. Doggerland's people survived by leaving. Their world survives because one harpoon came back.